She was hungry and begged for a piece of bread before the court, but was humiliated by the king. Winter lay hard upon the kingdom of Valmont, each breath a visible cloud in the air, each footstep a crisp echo against the frozen ground. In the streets of Marseille, the poor huddled beneath tattered shawls and thin cloaks, their eyes hollow with hunger, their limbs trembling with cold that seeped into the marrow. Snow crusted the rooftops and gathered in dirty heaps against the stone walls, turning the city into a white, silent prison for those without the means to escape it. But within the towering palace of Marseille, the world was cast in an altogether different light. There the great crystal chandeliers blazed with thousands of beeswax candles, their flames mirrored in the polished marble floors and gilded mirrors. The throne room, a vast expanse of gold leaf and pale blue silk panels, shimmered with life. Musicians played softly in the gallery, the strains of violin and harpsichord weaving through the din of conversation and laughter. It was a night of celebration, hosted by King Léonce IV in honor of foreign dignitaries newly arrived from the northern courts. The nobility had turned out in full force. Ladies floated through the room in shimmering gowns of satin and brocade, their powdered coiffures adorned with pearls and plumes. Gentlemen strutted in jewel-encrusted waistcoats and velvet frock coats, faces powdered and rouged, movements graceful and practiced. The air was thick with perfume, spiced wine, and the cloying sweetness of sugared confections, the scent of privilege. At the head of the room, upon an elevated dais, King Léonce IV sat in a carved throne of ebony and gold. His crown gleamed beneath the candlelight, his heavy-lidded gaze sweeping over his courtiers with the cold detachment of one who viewed his people as ornamental rather than essential. At his right stood Prince Adrien, his second son, tall, striking in his burgundy velvet frock coat and ivory waistcoat, a man whose steel blue eyes reflected neither boredom nor delight, only a studied indifference that had become second nature at court. Outside the palace gates, Héloïse Fournier stumbled through the snow, her breath ragged in her throat, her thin cloak soaked through and clinging to her body. In her arms, swaddled in what little warmth she could muster, her younger brother Luc whimpered softly, fevered and growing weaker by the hour. His skin burned against her chest. His breaths came too fast, too shallow. Weeks of poverty had drained what little hope she'd possessed. Her father's disgrace, the false charges that had seen their family ruined, had left her penniless and scorned. The friends and patrons who had once welcomed her had vanished like smoke. No merchant would offer her credit. No physician would tend a Fournier child. She had sold her last scrap of jewelry for bread a fortnight ago. Now, even that was gone. She had resisted this moment with every shred of pride. But there was nothing left. Snow bit into her cracked lips as she made her way toward the palace. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her choice dragged at her very bones. She could feel her father's voice in her mind, warning her against shame. But Luc's body was hot and limp in her arms, and no warning could silence the fear that clawed at her. She would beg, before the king himself, if that was what it took. At the palace gates, the guards sneered, but did not bar her path, perhaps out of amusement, or perhaps sensing no threat from the thin, ragged girl clutching a bundle to her breast. The great doors loomed ahead, towering and gilded. Through the windows, Héloïse caught glimpses of a world so distant from her own it might as well have been another realm, light and music, silks and laughter. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she moved forward, her chin lifting despite the tremor in her limbs. Inside the throne room, the music swelled, the courtiers' laughter rising like a tide. Prince Adrien tilted his head as a young countess whispered something scandalous in his ear. He answered with a faint, practiced smile, his gaze wandering past her to the musicians beyond. Distraction suited him tonight. Distraction was safer than engagement. Then the doors burst open. The wind rushed in first cold and sharp, extinguishing candles near the entrance. The room fell into a hush as every eye turned toward the intruder. Héloïse stood in the doorway, snow clinging to her hair and lashes, her cloak sodden and dripping onto the marble floor. For a moment, she faltered beneath the weight of their stares, but then she stepped forward, each movement deliberate. Gasps rippled through the court. The Countess de Rouvray let out a small cry and pressed a lace kerchief to her mouth. A nobleman's laughter rang out, brittle and mocking. At the dais, King Léonce narrowed his gaze. Eloise reached the foot of the dais and sank to her knees, the movement sudden and graceless. The chill of the marble seeped through her skirts, but she barely felt it. Luc whimpered softly in her arms. Her voice, when it came, was raw and hoarse from the cold. "Please," she said, each word dragging across her throat. "I ask nothing for myself. Only bread. My brother is ill. He will die." A beat of stunned silence met her plea. Then laughter erupted. The courtiers shifted and whispered behind jeweled fans, their voices rising in gleeful cruelty. "Imagine," one baroness drawled, "begging in a ballroom. How quaint." "She should have chosen a better audience," another remarked. "We are not the Bakers' Guild." Prince Adrian felt his mouth tighten, though he schooled his features into a mask of detached amusement. The scene struck at something he preferred not to name. He had seen beggars aplenty in the city, had learned long ago to turn away. But here the spectacle unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers and the watching eyes of foreign ambassadors. King Léonce's voice cut through the noise. "Remove her," he commanded, the words cold as steel. "This is not a place for filth." Two guards moved forward. Adrian, watching, found himself speaking before he thought. "Perhaps the court could spare a crust, father," he said lightly, his tone laced with irony. "Such generosity would surely not bankrupt the crown." Laughter greeted the jest, though a few glances turned toward him with curiosity. Adrien smiled faintly, outwardly unbothered, though inside he felt a curious disquiet. As the guards seized Eloise's arms, she clutched Luc tightly, a soft cry escaping her lips. Her cloak fell open in the struggle, and for an instant, Adrien caught a clear glimpse of the child's pale, sweat-slick face, his small body wrapped in threadbare cloth. The jest turned to ash in his mouth. A hard knot of guilt formed in his chest as the guards dragged her across the floor, her protests growing fainter. Her dignity, even in ruin, struck him with unexpected force. Without another word, Adrien turned from the dais and left the group of courtiers, ignoring the puzzled glances that followed him. His steps carried him swiftly through the side corridors, away from the music and warmth. In a disused antechamber, he retrieved his cloak and fastened it over his shoulders. The cold struck him like a slap when he emerged into the night, but he scarcely noticed. His breath steamed in the air as he made his way through the palace gates, eyes scanning the snow-swept street beyond. There, a flash of movement. A thin figure, half running, half stumbling, vanished into the dark tangle of alleys. Adrien followed without hesitation. The night had swallowed the city whole, its alleys a maze of darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of a street lamp. Snow drifted steadily from the black sky, muffling the world in a hush that seemed almost reverent. Adrien moved swiftly through the twisting lanes of the old quarter, his boots crunching over ice-slicked cobbles. The bitter cold bit through the folds of his cloak, but he paid it no heed. His gaze remained fixed ahead, where the slim figure of the woman darted in and out of shadow. She was quick, despite her burden. The child in her arms hung limp beneath the folds of her tattered cloak, and still she pressed on, weaving through the winding streets with the desperate instinct of a hunted creature. Adrien kept his distance, careful not to startle her into flight. The narrow lanes grew darker the deeper they went, the stone walls closing in, the silence broken only by his own breath and the faint, ragged sound of hers drifting back to him. He had no plan, only a restless urgency that gripped him tighter with every step. At last, Eloise halted before a crumbling church, its once grand facade mottled with age and soot. The heavy doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Without hesitation, she pushed through the smaller side entrance, the groan of old wood lost to the snow-heavy air. Adrian waited a beat before moving closer. The nave within was dark, but pale shafts of moonlight pierced the broken, stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns across the flagstones. Through the gap in the doorway, he saw her cross the nave and disappear into a small side vestry. He followed silently. Peering through the cracked doorframe, he watched as she knelt before the cold hearth, her breath fogging the air in thin white wisps. With careful, practiced movements, she unwrapped the child and laid him upon a pallet of rags. The boy's face was flushed with fever, beads of sweat glistening on his brow. His small body shuddered beneath the threadbare blanket she drew up around him. Adrian's throat tightened. She moved with the calm of one who had done this many times, though her shoulders trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion. From a battered satchel she drew a cloth and dipped it in a tin basin of snowmelt, wringing it out before pressing it gently to the child's burning skin. "Shh, mon cœur," she whispered, her voice hoarse but tender. "Stay with me." Adrian's guilt grew sharper with every moment. He could still hear the echo of his own careless jest in the throne room, could still see the flash of her anguished eyes as the guards had dragged her away. That this was the boy she had fought for, the reason she had thrown herself at the mercy of the court. He had not imagined this depth of love in a world so stripped of compassion. And yet, she was alone. Entirely alone. He hesitated only a moment longer before stepping through the doorway, his footsteps light but deliberate. She spun at the sound, eyes wide, one hand instinctively shielding the child. "Stay back." Her voice was sharp, fierce despite her weariness. Adrian lifted his hands slowly. "I mean you no harm." She said nothing, only watched him with wary eyes, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. He forced his voice calm. "You need help. The boy. He needs a physician." "No one will come," she said bitterly. "Not for us. Someone will. If I send him." He took another cautious step forward, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the thinness of her face. "Please, let me help." She shook her head. "Why would you care?" Her gaze narrowed, suspicion flashing through her exhaustion. He did not answer. How could he explain the pull that had driven him here, the restless compulsion that had eclipsed reason? Instead, he knelt slowly beside the hearth, keeping his movements unthreatening. "I can arrange for an apothecary to bring what the boy needs. Food, medicines." He looked at her steadily. "You have nothing to lose by accepting." For a long moment she said nothing. Then her gaze flicked to Luke, whose shallow breaths had grown more labored. A flicker of anguish passed over her features. She closed her eyes. "If it is a trick." "It is not." His voice was quiet but certain. Another beat of silence. Then she gave a single, reluctant nod. Adrian rose at once, drawing his cloak tighter around him. "I'll return shortly. You'll need warmth as well." When he left the church, the cold struck him anew. The streets remained empty, the snow deeper now beneath his feet. He moved swiftly through the winding lanes toward the home of Monsieur Renaud, a discreet apothecary known to him. The man grumbled at the late hour, but agreed to prepare what was needed after a few clipped words from Adrian and the quiet press of gold into his palm. Within an hour, Adrian returned to the church with a parcel of food and a small case of medicines, Renaud following with additional supplies. They entered the vestry to find Eloise still at the boy's side, her fingers trembling slightly as she replaced the cloth on his brow. At sight of the stranger, she stiffened, but Adrian spoke quickly. "He's here to help. Only for the boy." Renaud wasted no time, kneeling to examine Luke with efficient hands. He murmured instructions to Eloise, who followed them in silence, her expression taut with uncertainty. Adrien kept back, watching as the man prepared a fever tonic and spoke of poultices and warmth. When the apothecary departed, Adrian remained, setting the parcel of food within her reach. "You should eat," he said quietly. She glanced at it but made no move. "Why?" The word was heavy with distrust. "Why would you do this?" He met her gaze. "Because no one else will." That answer seemed to unsettle her more than any false kindness might have. She looked away, drawing her knees close to her chest as though bracing against unseen blows. Adrian stayed only a little longer that night, sensing her need for solitude. Before he left, he said simply, "I'll return tomorrow, if you'll allow it." She gave no reply. And yet, when he returned the next day, his arms laden with a fresh bundle of supplies, she did not turn him away. The hours that followed unfolded in a rhythm of uneasy truce. Each time he came, Eloise watched him with guarded eyes, her body always positioned protectively between him and Luke. Yet necessity forced her to accept his help, and bit by bit, her resistance showed cracks. Adrian marveled at her strength. How she moved with grace even in exhaustion, how her hands, though roughened by hardship, held a rare tenderness when they touched her brother's fevered skin. There was no self-pity in her, no demand for more than what was needed. Their conversations were brief, each word chosen with care, yet beneath the clipped exchanges, an unspoken awareness took root, an understanding neither dared voice. On the third evening, as snow whispered against the stained glass and the fire Adrian had built cast a soft glow over the small room, he found himself lingering. The silence between them was no longer hostile, but taut with something unnamed. As he knelt to adjust the fire, a slip of the tongue betrayed him. "Better warmth than the palace cellars," he murmured absently. The words hung in the air. Eloise's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with sudden clarity. For a heartbeat, Adrian saw the full force of her suspicion flare to life. "You," her voice was low, dangerous, "you speak of the palace." He looked up, meeting her gaze, and in that instant understood that she knew. Knew he was no common stranger. Knew, perhaps, that he was no ally at all. The snow had not stopped through the long hours of night. A thick, suffocating hush had settled over Marseillais by dawn, muting the world beneath its weight. Inside the cold stone vestry, Eloise barely slept. She had kept vigil at Luke's side, her mind restless even when his fever began to subside. The apothecary's medicines had eased the worst of it, but the danger was far from past. She had thought through every word, every glance the prince, no, Adrian, had given her the night before. She did not know what had driven him to her aid, or why he had returned again and again. But one thing was clear. He belonged to the world that had destroyed her family. No matter what softness she had glimpsed beneath his manner, she could not trust him. She must not. By first light, her decision was made. With trembling fingers, she bundled Luke in layers of cloth and tucked him against her breast. The little boy stirred faintly, but did not wake. Her heart clenched at the frailty of his body, the unfairness of what he had endured. And now, it would be her doing if they remained here, exposed to the gaze of palace eyes and the whims of those who trafficked in cruelty. She gathered what little remained, a bundle of rags, a pouch of coins Adrian had left though she had not asked for it. Pride burned at her throat as she tucked it away, but survival left little room for principle. Her limbs felt leaden with fatigue, yet purpose drove her. Before the first bells of morning had sounded, she slipped from the church into the snow-veiled streets. When Adrian arrived not long after, the vestry stood silent. The embers in the hearth had gone cold. The narrow bed of rags lay empty, as did the small basin where he had seen her tending the boy. A chill of panic cut through him sharper than any wind. He searched the nave, the side chapels, calling her name once. But the only answer was the mournful creak of timbers under the snow's weight. She was gone. A single trace remained. Small, shallow footprints leading out into the street. Adrian threw his cloak around his shoulders and followed them at once, his heart pounding with a strange, unfamiliar fear. He had thought to come this morning to speak plainly, to make her see that he meant no harm. Now the fragile thread between them threatened to snap. Through the twisting alleys he searched, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Shopkeepers opening their shutters shook their heads at his inquiries. The hours slipped by. By afternoon, the streets were thick with carriages and peddlers, the marketplace awakening despite the snow. It was there, beneath the awnings strung between wooden stalls, that Adrian caught sight of her. Eloise stood near the edge of the marketplace, her thin form swaddled in her tattered cloak. Beside her, a modest carriage waited, its wheels crusted with slush. A rough-faced driver loaded a bundle into the rear compartment. Luke lay bundled in her arms, his small face barely visible beneath the layers. Adrian moved before he could think. Eloise. She spun at the sound of his voice. A flash of alarm crossed her face, and her grip on Luke tightened. Stay back. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with resolve. You cannot follow me. He stopped a few paces away, the marketplace noise fading beneath the pulse in his ears. I'm not here to stop you, he said. His breath came hard, more from emotion than exertion. But I won't let you vanish without understanding why. Her eyes darkened. Why? She repeated bitterly. Because I will not let a royal meddle in my life, not when your court has already taken everything from me. I'm not the court, he said quietly. She shook her head. You are its son. That is enough. The words stung, more than he could have admitted. But he forced himself to speak through the ache. Listen to me. His voice dropped, the rawness beneath it unguarded. This is not charity. Not some whim to ease my conscience. I want... He broke off, struggling to shape the truth into words that would not frighten her more. I want your trust, and more than that, I want to know you. To help, yes. But not because I am a prince. She stared at him, her breath quickening. The vulnerability in his tone, so at odds with the cold figure she had seen in the palace, unsettled her. For a moment the storm within her warred with the instinct to flee. Luke shifted weakly in her arms, drawing her gaze downward. Her throat tightened. Why would you risk this? She whispered. Because I can't do otherwise. The words came without calculation. A beat passed, then another. At last, her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion and choice. One meeting, she said quietly. In private. No more. Relief flared in Adrian's chest, tempered by caution. He nodded once. I'll come to you. She turned swiftly then, stepping into the carriage. The door closed behind her, and the driver snapped the reins. Adrian watched as the carriage rolled away through the snow-choked streets, her silhouette framed against the frost-blurred window. Over the next days, their fragile accord unfolded in stolen hours. He found her again in the vestry, returning as promised. Each visit was marked by caution at first, each word weighed. Yet with each passing hour, the walls between them thinned. In the quiet shadows of the abandoned church, Adrian listened as Eloise spoke of her family's fall, of her father, a merchant of integrity, whose enemies in court had conspired to ruin him. Falsely accused, imprisoned without trial, his fortune seized. How her mother had wasted away with grief. How Eloise had fought to keep her brother alive with no help, no allies. The knowledge struck Adrian with a force he had not expected. A sickness of guilt churned within him. The court's petty cruelties, the games of power he had long disdained, had left real ruin in their wake. She did not seek his pity. She spoke with a calm forged from survival, her voice steady even when her eyes shone with the memories she could not banish. For Adrian, her presence became a quiet necessity, a balm to a life hollowed by privilege. He lingered longer each time, though never without a glance over his shoulder. For Eloise, his persistence awakened something far more dangerous than gratitude. No matter how she tried to suppress it, his gaze, the earnestness in his voice, the warmth of his presence, stirred a longing she had no right to feel, a longing that left her heart racing and her resolve fraying. Their growing bond did not go unnoticed. Duchess Clarice observed Adrian's increasing absences with cold calculation. Whispers reached her soon enough of the prince's solitary excursions into the lower quarters. A smile touched her painted lips, though her eyes gleamed with ruthless intent. She set her informants to work. When word reached King Léonce, the summons came swiftly. Adrien entered the royal audience chamber beneath the weight of his father's gaze. The courtiers in attendance watched with veiled interest, sensing the tension beneath the formal trappings. The king wasted no pretense. "You will end this folly at once," he commanded. "Whatever whim drives you toward that woman, you will forsake it. To do otherwise is to invite exile and disgrace." The warning rang clear. Adrien met his father's stare with a defiance he did not bother to hide. But he said nothing. That night, beneath the cloak of darkness, he penned a single message. "Meet me beneath the old cathedral at midnight. We must speak." He sealed it swiftly and dispatched it with a trusted courier, unaware that eyes now followed his every move. The wind whipped through the snow-dusted square beneath the old cathedral, rattling the iron-latched gates and moaning through the towering arches like a chorus of restless spirits. Midnight tolled faintly from the bell tower above, each resonant strike echoing through the vast expanse of stone and shadow. Adrien stood beneath one of the great pillars, his cloak drawn tightly around him, though the cold had long ceased to register. His pulse beat fast and heavy, louder than the bells, louder than the wind. He had come alone, slipping past the watchful eyes that now shadowed his every movement, driven by a conviction that had begun to consume him. He had written to her with trembling fingers, knowing full well the risk, and yet knowing too that he could no longer retreat into the safety of pretense. Not after what had passed between them, and not when the court's noose had begun to tighten around her fragile world. The hush of footsteps reached him then, a soft, tentative sound against the frozen ground. He turned. Eloise emerged from the gloom beneath the archway, her cloak drawn close around her, the pale oval of her face framed by loose tendrils of chestnut hair. Her eyes found his, wary and luminous in the dark. In her arms, she carried Luke, bundled tightly against her. The child stirred faintly, but Adrien's gaze remained fixed on her alone. She stopped a few paces from him, her breath forming quick clouds in the frigid air. "I should not have come," she whispered. "You did." His voice was rough, steadier than he felt. "That is enough." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of the space between them heavier than the stone above. Then Adrien took a slow step forward. "I had to see you," he said. "To tell you what I should have spoken plainly before." Her chin lifted slightly, though her fingers tightened protectively around Luke. "I can no longer hide behind the comforts of my birth," he continued, each word carefully chosen, each one drawn from the depths of a heart that had been too long armored. "Not when every moment away from you feels hollow. I will not let them silence me or drive you from this city. I will face whatever comes, but I will do it openly. And for you." The rawness in his tone sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She swallowed hard. "Do you know what you're saying?" Her voice trembled. "What it will cost you?" "I know," he said simply. "And I do not care." She stared at him, struggling against the tide rising within her. "You must not speak of love, Adrien. Not to me." "But I do." His breath caught. "I love you, Eloise. I have tried to reason with myself to think as they would expect, but I cannot." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. The truth of her own feelings pressed against her chest, fierce and terrifying. She had fought them with every ounce of pride and fear, but no more. "Adrien," her voice broke, "you cannot fight the court your father for me." He reached out slowly, as though afraid she might vanish like mist. "I can." His hand brushed her cheek, the warmth of his palm a shock against her chilled skin. "And I will." Tears burned behind her eyes, blurring the sharp angles of his face. "And if they destroy you for it? If they take everything? Then let them." His gaze never wavered. I would rather lose a kingdom than lose you." A sob escaped her then, soft and helpless. She swayed forward, her resistance crumbling beneath the force of his words. His arms came around her gently, drawing her and Luke close. Beneath the towering stone pillars, they stood locked in a tender, desperate embrace, two figures against a vast, indifferent world. Neither saw the shadowed forms that lingered just beyond the edge of the archway. Neither sensed the sharp gleam of eyes that watched, nor the silent footsteps retreating into the night. Morning brought no solace. Eloise had returned to her temporary refuge with Luke, her heart still trembling from the intensity of their meeting. But even before the first light had fully broken across the rooftops, sharp raps at the door shattered the fragile quiet. Guards, half a dozen of them, forced their way in, their eyes cold and triumphant. A folded parchment bearing the royal seal was thrust before her, its words a twisted mockery of justice. She was under arrest, charged with sedition, with inciting rebellion among the lower classes, with plotting to defame the crown. She had no chance to resist. Luke's cries were muffled beneath the heavy arms that tore him from her grasp. She fought like a wild thing until a brutal cuff sent her sprawling to the floor, dazed and breathless. When they dragged her to her feet and bound her wrists, she no longer had the strength to protest. Only the raw defiance in her eyes remained untouched. Word spread swiftly through the city and the court. By midday, the grand hall of the palace thrummed with poisonous anticipation. Nobles gathered in clusters, their whispers sharp as blades. The scandal had been sown with ruthless precision. Duchess Clarice stood amid them, her smile as smooth as porcelain, her eyes gleaming with victory. The massive doors groaned open, and Eloise was led in, her wrists bound, her cloak torn and stained with dirt. Her face was pale but unbowed, her chin lifted despite the jeers that greeted her entrance. At the dais, King Léonce watched with a gaze of icy disdain. Before the court, the fabricated charges were read aloud, each one more damning than the last. The nobles murmured and scoffed, their pleasure in her humiliation thinly veiled. Then, as the final accusation echoed through the vaulted chamber, the heavy doors burst open once more. Adrian strode in, his cloak flaring behind him, his boots striking the marble floor with purpose. Conversation faltered, eyes turned in stunned silence as he approached the dais. Without waiting for leave to speak, he turned to the assembly, his voice ringing clear. "This is a farce." The words hung in the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the room. "She stands accused because she dared defy cruelty," Adrian continued, his gaze sweeping over the sea of astonished faces. "And because I love her." A collective breath seemed to leave the chamber. King Léonce surged to his feet, his face darkening with fury. "You disgrace yourself," he thundered. Adrian faced him without flinching. "No, father. I redeem myself." The court teetered between outrage and fascination. Murmurs rose like a tide. Through the blur of voices and faces, Eloise stared at Adrian, her heart pounding. His words had pierced the thick veil of fear and shame that had bound her. Tears threatened, but she held them back, her gaze locked on his. He turned to her now, voice gentler. "You need not fear them." A tremor shook her, but strength surged beneath it. Lifting her head, her voice rang out steady and clear. "I do not," she said. "Because I love you." The words broke the last of the court's brittle composure. Nobles gasped and whispered, the room alive with stunned disbelief. The king's face was a mask of wrath. "You will renounce this madness, Adrian," he commanded, "or you will lose all." Adrian's breath caught, but his resolve only deepened. With the court in uproar, he turned fully to Eloise, his voice low but unwavering. "Will you stand beside me, even now?" Her whispered answer reached him like a vow. "Yes." In the days that followed that fateful court session, the palace seemed caught between breathless stillness and simmering unrest. Whispers stalked the gilded halls as surely as shadows. Courtiers who had once smirked behind jeweled fans now cast uncertain glances when Adrian passed. The boldness of his defiance and Eloise's unwavering answer had rippled far beyond the marble walls of the throne room. Adrian spent those days in deliberate preparation. He moved with a calm that masked the storm within, but every step he took was purposeful. Word of his intention spread quickly. If his father denied him the right to wed Eloise, Adrian would renounce all claim to the throne. The court was in an uproar, its old guards hissing warnings and threats, but they could not shake his resolve. In the streets beyond the palace, something altogether different began to stir. The common folk, who had watched with bitterness as nobles jeered the woman who had once knelt for a piece of bread, now whispered a different tale. News of Adrian's public stand, of his unshaken loyalty to Eloise even under his father's wrath, fanned into every corner of Marseille. Vendors murmured of the prince who dared love a ruined commoner. Mothers told their children of the woman who had stood unbowed before a king. Where once there had been indifference, now there was admiration. At the same time, certain nobles, those of reformist leanings long weary of the crown's tyranny, saw an opportunity. In private salons and over subdued cups of wine, they began voicing support for Adrian's choice, not merely for the romance, but for what it symbolized. They were cautious, of course, but they understood that to openly condemn the prince now risked alienating a restless public. Behind the scenes, in the quiet sanctum of her private chambers, Queen Isabeau watched and waited. She summoned her husband late one evening. No courtiers attended. Only the flicker of the hearth accompanied her words. "My lord," she began, her voice low, even. "You know I have rarely spoken against your judgments. But this will not fade with silence." Léant stood by the window, his hands clasped behind him. His profile was carved from ice. "You would have me yield to a spectacle," he said coldly. She rose, her silken gown whispering against the floor. "I would have you preserve the crown," she answered. "Adrian will not relent. The people see him as they have never seen you. Deny him and they will not forget, nor will the nobles who already taste the winds of change." For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then a single word escaped him, low and bitter. "Fool." But Isabeau saw the flicker of doubt behind his eyes. The final audience was called 3 days later. Adrian entered the royal chamber with the same steady gaze he had worn in court, though the weight of what he stood to lose pressed at his back like a gathering storm. Word had spread of this meeting, and though the king had ordered the chamber closed to most, a select group of nobles was present. Among them the Duchess Clarisse, pale with barely contained fury. Eloise was not summoned. Adrian had insisted on this much. If battle was to be waged, she would not stand as a pawn upon the floor. King Léonce regarded his son with the impassive gaze of a monarch well used to command. "You come to demand terms," he said without preamble. Adrian stood tall. "I come to offer sacrifice." A hush swept the chamber. "If you forbid this union," Adrian continued, voice clear, unwavering, "I will renounce my claim. I will forfeit title and privilege. I will walk from this palace and not return." A gasp rose from the gathered nobles. Even those who opposed him shifted uneasily. The words, once only whispered rumor, were now laid bare before the king's throne. Queen Isabeau watched in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Léonce's jaw tightened. "You would abandon crown and kin for a woman of no standing? For a beggar's daughter?" "For the woman I love," Adrian said, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. The room seemed to hold its breath. Clarisse's voice, sharp as a blade, broke the silence. "Your Majesty, this is madness." "To allow such a thing?" But the king silenced her with a glance. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The king paced slowly before the dais, each step measured, deliberate. At last he stopped, hands resting heavily upon the arms of his throne. "You shame this house," he said, voice low. Adrian inclined his head. Then let shame be mine. Another pause, longer this time. When Léonce finally spoke, his words came heavy with reluctant finality. So be it. If you would throw away a kingdom, I will not stand in your path, but do not expect blessing, nor favor. Adrian exhaled softly, his heart pounding. I expect neither, he said. The court shifted, the ripple of stunned disbelief visible in every glance. Clarice's composure cracked at last. Her eyes gleamed with unshed rage. Her carefully wrought schemes had unraveled in a single breath. In the hours that followed, news spread like wildfire. The palace buzzed with gossip and dissent, yet beneath it all lay an undercurrent of uneasy respect. The prince had stood before the king and chosen love over crown, and the world had witnessed it. The modest ceremony took place 2 days later, beneath the soaring arches of the old cathedral, where Adrian and Eloise had first embraced beneath the shadows. Snow fell gently that morning, blanketing the city in a hush as if the heavens themselves honored the day. The pews were not crowded. Many nobles had chosen to stay away, unwilling to be seen supporting the union. But those who did attend stood with heads held high. Reform-minded lords, old friends of Adrian's mother, a scattering of merchant families whose lives had also borne the scars of courtly cruelty. At the center of it all stood Adrian and Eloise. She wore a gown of soft ivory muslin, her hair gathered simply at her nape, a small posy of winter jasmine in her hands. No jewels, no crown, only her steady gaze and the quiet grace that had drawn Adrian from the safety of a prince's life into the raw heart of the world. Adrian stood beside her, clad not in princely finery, but in a simple dark frock coat and cream waistcoat. A blue sash remained at his side, not as a mark of power, but as a symbol of the choice he had made. The ceremony was brief but rich with meaning. As they exchanged vows beneath the soaring vaults, a hush fell over the assembled guests, as if the stones themselves bore witness to the moment. When the priest's final blessing echoed through the space, Adrian drew Eloise into his arms with quiet reverence, their first kiss as husband and wife, sealing not only their union, but the long road they had traveled to reach it. Outside, the streets awaited them. Hand in hand, they stepped beyond the cathedral doors into the bright chill of morning. The city stirred at their passing. Common folk lined the edges of the square, some silent, others smiling faintly. Here and there, voices called soft blessings. A small child tossed petals of faded silk at their feet. Adrian glanced at Eloise, her fingers warm in his, her gaze lifted toward the path ahead. No longer prince and beggar, they walked side by side through the streets of Marseille, equals bound by love and the hard-won freedom that no crown could ever command. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.